Rome's early history is mostly unknown, but there's evidence that people started to live in the area of Rome as early as 800 BC. It became a city at 753 BC, when Rome's first king, Romulus, was crowned, though the date of formation of the city could be 50 years before or after that date. Starting with the first emperor Augustus's rule, began a golden age of peace and prosperity, reaching its peak at AD 117. Emperor Diocletian in AD 285 declared that the Roman Empire was too large to manage, so he split the empire into two, and in AD 395, the split became official. The Roman Empire became two different empires after the death of Theodosius, the first in AD 395. The two halves were given to Theodosius' sons. Arcadius was given the eastern half, and Honorius was given the western half. The capital of Western Rome was Mediolanum. By the way, the people who controlled the two halves still saw themselves as joint rulers of the same empire. So Roma, or as we call it, Rome, was the spiritual capital of the whole empire. But realistically, the two were separate at this point, having two different governments, armies, and allies. Both sides of the Roman Empire called themselves the Quirites, which means descendants of the god Quirinus. Quirites became the name of the people of the Roman Empire because it was the given name of Romulus, the founder of the city and Rome's first king. The language the Romans used was Latin, which was the language they used from start to finish. And this is what it looks like. The Western Roman flag looked like this. This flag is called Shiro. It's also known as Chrismon. This symbol was made by combining the first two capital letters, Shi and Rho, of this Greek word, pronounced as Christos, which is the name and title synonymous with Jesus. Housing in the Western Roman Empire stayed more or less the same as the housing and architecture during the times of the Roman Empire. Most people lived in apartment-like buildings called insula. The ground floor had stores called tabernae, and the upper floors were apartments called saecula. The lower floors of the insula normally had more space, private toilets, and are generally more luxurious than the upper floors. The upper floors were smaller and poorer, with no private toilets, instead having public toilets. But because of the small proximity of the insulae, they had many issues. Fires were so common that waking up to the smell of something burning is normal. In contrast, the rich nobles lived in mansions called domus. The reason only a small amount of people are able to live in these domus is because it was very costly. The building materials such as marble and decorations were extremely expensive for a normal person. In both the Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire, housing is a status symbol. Where you live is directly connected to who you are and how high your status is. When someone asks you what the Romans wore, you would probably picture a man wearing a toga. And you're correct. But togas were only worn by noblemen as a status symbol during the formal events. So it would be the equivalent of a nice suit. Togas had many varieties. For example, probably the most well-known one was the pure white toga, the virides. These were worn by young men to signal their transition to adulthood, and the purple toga, or the picta, was made with the finest of dyes in the color of royal purple. With golden embroidery, these were for generals to wear when celebrating a victory in battle. These togas were probably made by the wives of these men. We know this because it was the most common thing written on a noblewoman's tombstone. The former wear for noblewomen was called the stola. It looked like a long sleeveless dress that was hung from the shoulders. A good example of this was the Statue of Liberty. The stola was only worn by married women, and unlike the toga, the stola didn't have much variety. So, to show their status, the Roman women wore jewelry and elaborate hairstyles instead. Unmarried women, children, and people of lower standing wore tunics. The Roman people had 2 to 3 meals a day. The first was lentaculum in the morning, normally consisting of bread, wine, nuts, fruits, and cheese. Next was prandium, which was eaten at noon. For noblemen, this was a light snack, like a pastry or some fruit. But for lower working classes, this was a large meal with meat, bread, and nuts to replenish their energy. Lastly was cena during the evening. These were normally elaborate, multi-course feasts for noblemen. The poor, however, typically didn't have enough money, so they normally skipped this meal. There are many things that we see and use every day that were invented or perfected by the Romans. Some examples are the Roman numerals. Though they're not used as commonly these days, being replaced by Arabic numbers, they still made trade much more convenient. The Romans also invented an early form of newspaper. It might not be the same as the daily news we read every day, but these slabs of stone had news of current affairs carved into them, giving the Roman citizens information about military victories, births, deaths, and even human interest stories. A few other things the Romans invented were aqueducts, the first surgery tools, the first books with binding, the Julian calendar, the postal system, and as I've already mentioned, apartment buildings called insula. One of the things Western Rome is most known for are its locations in architecture. One of these that you might know of is the Colosseum, which is an oval amphitheater in the center of the city of Rome. It's the largest ancient amphitheater ever built and is still the largest standing amphitheater in the world today, despite being built almost 2,000 years ago in 70 AD. Another very important location is the Arch of Constantine, a triumphal arch in Rome dedicated to the Emperor Constantine the Great. The arch was commissioned by the Roman Senate to commemorate Constantine's victory over Maxentius at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in AD 312. Vatican City is also a very important location worth mentioning. It's the smallest country in the world and also the center of Christianity, and where the Pope lives. There are many more locations I would like to mention, but there are way too many to mention in this presentation.